remote site on a cold mountain in Virginia, USA, and the short flight of a B-25 bomber that eventually claimed the lives of 5 young American trainee airmen. An official report that is at odds with eyewitness accounts. The crash on Sharp Top Mountain in Virginia is one of many that are still the subject of debate and controversy to this very day. There are so many unanswered questions for the families.
They didn't know about the peaks, and had they been able to climb 500 more feet, they'd have been able to clear the peaks.
Now, World War II air crash detective Garth Barnard is able to do what, at the time, the US Air Force couldn't. He's going to carry out a full modern investigation into the Sharp Top Mountain crash, which he hopes will finally give the families of those who died and the local community some real answers.
There's molten metal everywhere.
Garth's investigation takes him to the remote crash site itself and out onto the surrounding towns to seek out eyewitnesses.
So I would focus on flying the airplane first so that it didn't crash.
A big ball of fire flew up in the sky, and then we got a boom.
He gets a unique insight into the challenges of flying a wartime B-25 bomber as he asks, what happened inside the cockpit that night? And was there anything else the pilot could have done to save the plane? Garth also asks if a similar crash could happen today.
We're all human, and when we make mistakes, then catastrophe can still occur.
He delves into the archives and speaks to crash experts, all to finally get at the truth behind one of the most infamous and controversial air crashes of the Second World War.
There's more to this. There's something went on here. This isn't just a navigational error. There was problems with the plane.
For 20 years, Garth Barnard has been investigating World War II air crashes from his home in Northamptonshire in the UK. Garth's usual cases involve aircraft and crews from the operational training units of the Royal Air Force. But this time a crash involving an American crew on a training mission has grabbed his interest.
I found a really intriguing crash here. It's in America, US, and it happened in February '43 in Virginia. It looks like it was a navigational exercise that went wrong, or something went wrong and killed the entire crew, sadly. And there seems to be a lot of unanswered questions, and we need to find out what caused the accident.
A twin-engine bomber flies low over the rooftops of the sleepy American town of Bedford in Virginia. The engines make a deafening noise. Sparks and flames spew from the plane's exhausts. Townsfolk peer from their homes. Some rush into their gardens, where they can just make out the aircraft, fast disappearing towards the Blue Ridge mountain range, some 12 miles to the north of the town. In the cockpit of the plane, Second Lieutenant Paul Pitts, his co-pilot William McClure, and navigator Hilary Blackwell are feverishly checking maps to establish their position. They know they're supposed to turn over the town of Lynchburg, but are the lights below the right town? Suddenly, there's a tremendous fireball. The plane has smashed into the side of nearby Sharp Top Mountain. Rescue teams rush to the scene, but it's too late. The 5 young crewmen aboard the B-25 aircraft are all dead, killed on impact. But why? What exactly caused the crash that cost the lives of 5 young men on that cold February night? Was it pilot error, engine failure, bad weather? Or could the men have been doomed before they even took off?
From my research, I've done a lot of work on the British crews and the training of British crews, but not a lot on the American crews and the Allies. I don't know so much about that. And what we need to find out is what caused this crash and why were they so far off course? And, you know, were really the crew to blame, really? I mean, we owe it to these guys to find out.
Garth's investigation begins at the Museum of Bedford, Virginia, where local historian Jennifer Thompson tells him more about the fate of the B-25.
Was there a lot of aerial activity at the time?
Not around Bedford, because there's not any kind of military base in Bedford or any in the neighboring counties. So to have this big plane come overhead, that was very unusual. It made the front page of the Bedford Bulletin a couple days later, which is our local newspaper, which is still around. And this is from February 4th, 1943. And this was quite interesting right here.
Quite a number of Bedford people heard the plane pass over the town a few minutes before it crashed, and all agree that it was flying very low, with the pilot apparently having trouble with the engines.
So there was a lot of people that apparently saw it. And some of the descriptions was that they were afraid it was going to take out some of the taller buildings in town and take out some of the trees. And some of the witnesses that are seeing it, they're describing it, they're like, wow, this is really low flying, and it's flying right to the peaks. As you can see, it took off some of the trees as well. And there's still big pieces of the plane up there. If anybody's ever been on Sharp Top, it's a nice hike, but you can't find the wreckage on the trail. You have to go off of the trail onto the side of the mountain to find it. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know about the peaks. And had they been able to climb 500 more feet, they'd have been able to clear the peaks.
To help him get a wider picture, Garth needs to understand the role of the B-25 in the American war strategy. He learns that it was part of the training effort to hugely increase the size and strength of the United States Air Force in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. America had seen the effectiveness of the German Luftwaffe in Europe, and with only about 2,500 qualified pilots of its own, it knew when it joined the war that it urgently needed more planes and more pilots. By the autumn of 1943, less than 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the number of trained American aircrew had increased from 2,500 to an extraordinary 93,000. Garth traces one of the young men going through this remarkable US training machine, and who fate put on the Sharp Top Mountain B-25. He was Hilary S. Blackwell from Santa Monica, California, who joined the Air Corps on the 8th of October 1941. Blackwell would have been subjected to a barrage of physical and mental assessments to see if he was made of the right stuff to become a US flyer. The letters Blackwell wrote to his older brother Aid give Garth a flavour of the thoughts of a young man preparing for war.
It seems almost inconsiderate that I'm in training for the purpose of taking a bomber over some country and blast the hell out of it. But I'm rather looking forward to it. Sometimes I sit back and think that I'm crazy to take on such a job with all the danger facing us.
For an American air cadet, a pilot cadet going through his training, I think the best way to describe the experience would be intense. It was a very, very high-grade syllabus. It took about 36 weeks to go from the very beginning to sort of fully-fledged operational pilot, and not everybody made it. You might sign up to be a pilot, and you might go through and get your wings successfully, but you might wash out as a pilot. You might be rejected because you didn't have the right aptitudes. That didn't mean to say you were out of the Air Force altogether. You might be reclassified for navigator training, for instance. Now, if you tried being a navigator and you were rubbish at maths and had no sense of direction, then you might be washed out again, and you might train to be an air gunner, say, or some other aircrew role.
Hilary S. Blackwell was one of those cadets who didn't make the cut as a trainee pilot. But as he found out, the screening process was not really an exact science.
I was sent down here as a future pilot, but have been taking a physical. My blood pressure is a bit high, though, so I may not make pilot. The next thing will be bombardier navigator, which is what I tried for in the first place, but supposedly didn't have enough math for. Figure it out yourself. At present, nothing is definite, so I'm as much in the dark as you.
On the 17th of December 1942, Hillary was finally commissioned as Second Lieutenant Blackwell, navigator. He was still only 22 years old. Garth discovers that Blackwell's final posting before deployment overseas was to be the Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina. It was here that he would get to know his crewmates and their plane, a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The crew had come together from all the corners of America. The pilot was 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Paul Pitts from Poteau, Oklahoma. His co-pilot was a former journalist from Indianapolis, 22-year-old William McClure. The bombardier George Benninga was also 22 and had married his school sweetheart only a month before in his hometown of Marietta, Minnesota. The crew's engineer was 29-year-old Peter Bissan. Garth finds out that on the evening of the 2nd of February, Blackwell's crew were sent out on yet another navigation training flight. It was a nighttime cross-country flight that took the crew on a northwards triangular path from their base to Raleigh in neighbouring North Carolina, and on up to Lynchburg in Virginia, where they were to simply turn round and head home. That evening, Blackwell and the rest of the crew climbed aboard their B-25. As Benninga and Bissan took their places in the cramped bomber, Pitts and McClure went through their pre-flight checklist and warmed the engines. Meanwhile, Blackwell made himself comfortable for the 3-hour flight, arranging his maps on the fold-out table in the navigator's position behind the pilots. At 7:43 p.m., Pitts eased the throttle back. The B-25 rumbled down the Columbia airstrip and rose into the night sky. Pitts then turned the aircraft northwards, towards Lynchburg. At 8:58 p.m., just over an hour into their flight, the plane flew over the town of Raleigh. 20 minutes later, at approximately 9:20 p.m., the B-25 had smashed into Sharp Top Mountain, and the whole crew were dead. Garth has now to pose one very important question. As Blackwell studied maps of the route before takeoff, did he take note of the hazardous Blue Ridge Mountains that lay 25 miles off course from his intended route? And just how did he and his crew end up there? Garth has managed to obtain the official accident report for the B-25 crash on Sharp Top Mountain. The report contains eyewitness accounts and an official narrative of the crash.
In the brief narrative of the accident report, it actually states here, and I quote, "Many persons in Bedford heard the plane go over, and most accounts indicated that it was unusually low altitude because of the loud noise. All agreed that the engines were running perfectly." Which is a bit of an inconsistency when I've spoken to Jennifer at the museum, and she showed me a newspaper article which actually stated that the aircraft was very low, but it also added that the witnesses said that the pilot seemed to be having trouble with the engines. So, which is it? You know, there's a bit of a contradiction there as to what the problem was. I mean, did they even know the mountains were nearby? I mean, was it engine problems? Were they lost? These are all things we need to find out.
Abe McCulloch is an instructor who flies extensively over the Blue Ridge Mountains. With his intimate knowledge of the landscape and the dangers facing a plane that unwittingly strays into the area, can Abe shed more light onto why the plane might have crashed?
If you're flying back in the World War II days, just the lack of navigational equipment was a lot more back then than it is now. If you're not sure of the terrain or the topography, or if your map is old or it's not accurate, and you pick an altitude or you get off course, and if you can't see it because it's night, then potentially you could run an airplane into the mountain.
At night, what reference points would you use when it's completely dark?
If it's at night and it's dark, just about the only thing you have to go by are either the stars, or you can pick out the different towns. If you look on my map here, there's different areas that are yellow. And those areas that are yellow at night, that's what you would see. That's the town lights. That's what would light up. You'd be able to figure out exactly where you are. But again, it's not incredibly accurate. Towns oftentimes look similar to each other.
If you experience some kind of problem and you realize you weren't going to make it over the top of the mountain, what options do you have then?
If I was distracted, if I had one engine quit and I was working on flying the other one, in aviation we say aviate, navigate, communicate. So aviate is keep flying the airplane. If one engine quits, it's very difficult to fly the plane. So I would focus on flying the airplane first so that I didn't crash. After that, I would navigate, and if I'm too distracted flying the airplane, maybe I forget to navigate and I run into the mountains, but hopefully not. But certainly any distraction like that in the cockpit leads to a much greater chance of something bad happening. We're pretty much right on top of our destination. So let me point it out to you. That lake there behind you, do you see that?
Yep.
That's the lake, okay? So if you go straight up this peak, that's
Yep.
where the accident is. You can kind of see the trail there.
As Garth gazes out over the Sharptop Mountain crash site for the first time, he now knows that flying in the area was always going to be very hazardous, particularly for an inexperienced crew. But how could they have become so lost? Even though it was a nighttime exercise, the accident report confirms the weather was fine with clear visibility, which meant that Blackwell should have been able to use the stars and the lights of towns as visual cues to keep the plane on course. If the weather was perfect for flying, then there should have been no reason for the plane to fly so low to check their position. Garth considers an alternative reason. Could engine trouble have been the cause? To help him find out, Garth must first discover if the B-25 was a reliable aircraft. He discovers that the North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber was one of the most versatile aircraft of World War II. The two-engine aircraft served in all theaters of the war, and it was made famous by the 1942 Doolittle raid on Tokyo, when 16 B-25s took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, becoming the first US aircraft to bomb mainland Japan. There's no doubt that the B-25 was a solid, reliable aircraft. Not only that, but Blackwell's plane had no bomb load, a crew of only 5 instead of the usual 6, and probably no ammunition in its machine guns. For what turned out to be its final flight, the plane was easily operating within its limits. Local teenager Bobby Keyes was leaving his house to go hunting with 2 of his brothers, just as the B-25 came down. He saw and remembers the whole tragic episode.
This plane was coming and looked like it was going to come pretty close over us. In fact, it come right over our barn. And it was spitting fire, you know, like an old car. And it started making a C-turn over the end of Suck Mountain. And I remember my brother Tom saying that they don't get out of there, pull out of there real soon, they're going to hit the peaks of Otter. And pretty soon they hit a rib on it. And when it hit that mountain, a big ball of fire flew up in the sky, and then we got a boom. In a few seconds, another big ball of fire went up, then we get another loud boom sign. My understanding, they flew out of Carolina, and the plan was they're supposed to turn over Alta Vista, which don't have no mountains they didn't have to worry about running into if they'd have just made the turn over Alta Vista.
Garth is fascinated by this new theory. Alta Vista is a small town 25 miles to the southeast of Bedford and 35 miles away from Lynchburg, the B-25's turning point. Is it possible that Blackwell and his crew mistook the lights of Bedford for those of Alta Vista? The immediate surrounding area is certainly relatively flat, and the crew would not have been expecting any mountains between that town and Lynchburg. Does this explain why they flew straight into Sharptop? And Keyes introduces another fascinating possibility, something that is at odds with the official report. Could weather have actually been a factor?
I would say it probably had a whole lot to do with it, because it wasn't no stars shining in the sky. It was a clouded over, you know. And possible we could see the outline of the mountain, but I'm not sure we could see the very top of the peaks of Otter ourselves.
Was there anything about the aircraft, when you saw it fly over, that seemed unusual?
Yeah, it was so low, you could see it was somewhat light in the cockpit of that plane. And the plane, like I say, it was backfiring, and sparkles was coming off of it. I don't know whether it was exhaust or not. I'm assuming it was. But I've often wondered why they were so low. And listening to that plane, maybe they just couldn't do no more. Couldn't get it to rise up, you know.
That was a fascinating chat with Bobby Keys. He's thrown up another inconsistency with this crash. The official report says that the weather was fine at that time, yet he states that a localised weather system, that the cloud was quite low at the time, and maybe that was why the aircraft was flying so low. But Bobby also states that the engines were coughing and spluttering and there were sparks coming out of the engines. So again, is that another reason why they were flying so low? They were looking for somewhere to put down.
Garth has found yet more evidence that contradicts the official report. Don Yergin, a local resident, has spent many years collating contemporary reports and sources on the Sharp Top Mountain crash, which he publishes online. One newspaper account published the day after the crash contradicts the official story.
I'm looking here at an article from the Roanoke Times from February 1943. And in it, Mrs. Morgan, in the article, she states that she saw the aircraft circling the town of Bedford, which kind of ties in with what Bobby said, where he said he saw the aircraft make a turn before it hit the mountain. So it didn't just fly straight into it, it was turning. So that's two eyewitnesses that both disagree with the official version of events.
It's an intriguing theory. Did Blackwell's B-25 fly low because the crew couldn't see through localised clouds and had become lost? Or were there problems with the engines which meant that the crew had to look for a place to land? If lights were on in the cockpit, it would certainly suggest that there was some confusion on board the B-25 that night. Can the crash site itself reveal any more valuable clues? Sharp Top Mountain sits on the very edge of the peaks of the Otter Mountain Range that rises up steeply from the flat land that surrounds Bedford, which lies 12 miles to the southeast. A path to the summit snakes up the western side of the mountain, but the crash site itself is approximately 1,000 feet below the top. To reach it requires dropping off the marked track and descending down the sheer eastern face until the scattered wreckage is found. With a recent snowfall and no local guide willing to tackle the icy conditions, it's going to be an extremely difficult, if not impossible, location for Garth to find. As Garth starts this stage of his investigation, he gets a real feel for how hard it must have been for the rescue teams of local people who went up the mountain the night of the crash. The accident was officially recorded at 9:20 p.m. and within half an hour, the first helpers were already on their way from Bedford. With a light snow hampering their progress, the first rescue team didn't reach the crash site until 12:30 a.m. June Good's husband was one of the men that went to help.
I can remember that he told me he went up there as a member of the crew, and it was a hard climb. It's a rocky mountain. The odor of the burning bodies was just dreadful. He also told me that they lost right many of the crew because they couldn't get up the hill. There was debris from the plane all over the side of the mountain there. They had to bring the bodies down, and they were slipping and sliding a lot. He just didn't like to talk about it. He said it was a dreadful thing. The
local volunteers toiled all the next day in the treacherous conditions and by 4 a.m. on the 4th of February, they had finally brought down the last of the 5 bodies.
There it is. There it is. There it is. That's the engine. That's it. Can you see that?
The first evidence Garth finds at the crash site is one of the bomber's 1,700 horsepower Wright Cyclone radial engines, which had been embedded into the mountainside for the last 70 years.
This is definitely B-25 radial engine, and just look at this. Look at this molten, where it's melted here. This area here, this section. Look how, where it's been melted from the vast heat, which again confirms the fire. Still got the olive green on it. Obviously a piece of bodywork torn away. And here, look, there's a mark, and you can see here the serial number after 70 years. The wiring on these secured nuts here is so shiny, it's like it's put on yesterday. And these are secure here, but these have just been pulled out by the destructive nature of the impact. It's just amazing to see, absolutely amazing. There's more wreckage here. You can actually see it here, the twisted wreckage here.
On the side of the mountain is a vast sea of tangled metal that stretches far down the peak. In the original report, a large debris field of approximately 600 feet was recorded. But over time the wreckage has moved position, with some pieces gradually working their way down the mountainside.
This to me looks like an engine mount. You have the circular construction area here which would hold the radial engine in position. But I'm just shocked by, as far as the eye can see, you've got wreckage in both directions. And the surprising thing is there's molten metal everywhere. This, there must have been flames. I mean, it must have been a scene of devastation. This must have been seen from miles away, absolutely miles away.
In 1943, the original investigators' crash theory was that as the plane was climbing, its propellers caught the trees of the ridge and their branches pulled the craft into the side of the mountain.
By being here, you sort of understand the scale of it all. I've spoken to a lot of people and I've visited the crash site. You sort of understand, or get an understanding for what really happened up here. But there are still questions to be asked about, what sort of condition the aircraft was in before it impacted. But after talking to the witnesses, there's not just one witness that's actually said this, that one of the engines was on fire. It was making a horrible noise before impact. So there was something going on there. And even though the official data suggests that the engines were running fine and it was all okay, there's more to this. There's something went on here. This isn't just what I consider to be just a navigational error. There was problems with the plane.
Garth has found that while mystery surrounds Sharptop Mountain, tragedies like it were far from uncommon. While the dreadful US combat losses in the skies over Europe and the Pacific have been widely documented, less is known about the astonishing number of deaths suffered among young men who are still training to fly. The rush to train air crews resulted in the loss of more than 7,000 aircraft and the deaths of over 15,000 young airmen. If the public at large were unaware of the carnage, the authorities were certainly not, as this military safety information film demonstrates.
In nearly every case, disregard of instructions, failure to observe tech orders, flight checks, and weather maps change a happy landing into scrap that will never get into the scrap.
So the Sharptop Mountain crash was certainly not an isolated tragedy. Buried in the official crash report, Garth Barnard has found an extraordinary series of transcripts that record telephone conversations on the 4th of February between Major Reed, the officer trying to clear up the crash, and other local military officers and police in the area. From the transcripts, Garth learns that although the B-25 crash was the worst, it was one of 3 that had occurred locally that night. Cleveland and his colleagues were obviously aware of the dangers.
Okay, we've had 2 crashes here at the base since yesterday. Plenty of this going on. All we can do is send in a lot of recommendations. Yeah, we gotta do something. They're starting to extend the runways here now. If this had happened a couple of weeks later, he'd have been mixed up with all the workmen and more people would have been injured. They're mixing oil with water, but they say, this is war.
As Garth can see from this brief exchange, the realities of trying to train a vast number of rookie flyers were beginning to hit home. But how difficult were these planes to fly? The Arizona wing of the Commemorative Air Force preserves a number of historic World War II aircraft. For Garth, this is a unique opportunity to further his investigation by experiencing a flight in a B-25 bomber for himself. Retired airline pilot Spike McLean flies the Commemorative Air Force's B-25, named the Maid in the Shade.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Glad to meet you.
Yeah, good.
Welcome to the Maid in the Shade.
Lovely, thank you.
Let me show you around.
Oh, yeah.
This is a real World War II veteran. It was born in 1943 in Kansas City, Kansas, and it flew 15-plus missions over Italy.
And it's a bomber, but does it behave like a bomber?
It is a bomber, but it was a light bomber, but it behaves halfway between a bomber and a fighter. It's got a lot more fighter in it than bomber. It only had about a 4,000-pound bomb load to it. But where the airplane really shined is in the South Pacific with all the machine guns on it. Low-level strafing, much like the A310 Warthog it does today.
What's it like to be in this aircraft and to fly this aircraft?
The aircraft is very fun to fly. It's very, very maneuverable. It's very quick. It's got a lot of inertia. Very, very responsive for a pilot standpoint. How about we just go for a ride?
Okay, sounds good.
Garth is now following in the footsteps of Hilary Blackwell and his crewmates. Can his flight help answer the questions about the flames seen coming from the engines of the B-25 over Bedford? As he takes off into the clear Arizona skies, Spike puts himself into the shoes of the B-25 bomber crew all those years ago.
If I was known that I was lost, I would probably gain altitude if I didn't know the surrounding terrain around me. You'd always want to be higher than the terrain. And your radio signals are much more reliable the higher you get.
Radio signals were a key tool for a World War II pilot. In addition to communication, a device called an automatic direction finder was able to trace the strength of a signal from a given radio source to confirm a plane's exact position. Could the mountains surrounding Bedford have interfered with the plane's equipment?
The radio signals are all kind of line of sight, and if you're behind a bunch of terrain like the mountains up ahead here, we would not be able to hear that signal as well being low as we would if we were up high and could see that. It's because the signals are line of sight.
And would there be, when the engines are running, you'd see like flames or sparks coming from the engines whilst it's flying?
Not during the daytime. The exhaust exits, of course, directly out the cylinder. So at nighttime, yes, you will see quite a bit of flame and not really so much sparks. But the engines glow quite well. All the cylinders have got looks like fire coming out of them. At night only.
If one engine failed, is the aircraft quite happy to fly on one engine?
Well, you betcha. After the engine, if an engine fails, it's quite capable of flying on one engine for an extended amount of time. The only thing that would is if the aircraft gets slow for any reason and gets below 145 miles per hour, it doesn't have any control after that low of a speed.
What is the turning circle of this aircraft?
Well, the radius is quite sharp on this airplane if you want it to be quite sharp. Some of the passengers on here right now probably wouldn't like me to show you, but it's enough to make you very uncomfortable. I could turn this thing in a dime. We're going to be taking a turn here in a minute. I'll give you a little example of what the airplane can do.
The evidence gathered from Garth's flight on the B-25 seems to answer some of the key questions. It appears that the engine trouble and flames reported by many witnesses on the ground could have been the byproducts of a normally operating aircraft. And even if the plane had engine problems, then it should have been able to easily miss the mountain if the crew had spotted it. As Garth heads back home to England, the evidence is starting to point to a tragic error in navigation. Garth has sent all the evidence he has unearthed in America to air safety expert Gary Wan, a man who has worked in the aviation industry for more than 30 years, to get his assessment.
The aircraft was tasked on the navigation sortie at 3,000 feet, which would have provided clearance above terrain for the whole route. But what it didn't take into account was the high ground to the northwest of Lynchburg and, in fact, Bedford. So that altitude that was given to the aircraft for the sortie did depend on the aircrew getting the turns right and turning at the right points. The aircraft may have descended from its cruising altitude to peep down below the weather, even though there was no reported weather at the time. After the accident, there was significant snow at the crash site. So that does suggest there would have been some weather around at the time, possibly close to the hills. If the pilot had seen the hills, he wouldn't have flown into them. There was no significant towns beyond the hills, so he'd be flying to an area of darkness anyway.
Next, Gary focuses on the reports of lights seen in the cockpit. Could this have contributed to the disaster?
The suggestion that the cockpit lights were turned up so they could see what was going on in the cockpit and probably check the maps, that would also make it more difficult for them to see outside and wouldn't have helped their night vision. It's a well-known fact that it takes about 30 minutes for your vision to return to normal after you've been exposed to bright lights. So even if the lights had only been switched on for a short time in the cockpit and then turned off, the pilot's vision wouldn't have been as good as it could have been. So that would have made it much more difficult to see anything out there, particularly something like an unlit hill or high ground.
In modern air accident investigations, the organizations that operate the planes come under the spotlight. In modern terms, was the crew of the B-25 properly supervised?
At wartime, there's an acceptance of a degree of risk that you wouldn't accept in peacetime, even in training. And certainly now, with any investigation, it isn't just the aircrew involved in the accident that will come under the microscope. It'll go a long way down, whether it's engineers, whether it's flying supervisors, whether it's other people involved in the flight. And the supervision is an oversight by somebody else to make sure that what you actually plan to do is sensible and safe. And in this case, it seemed that supervision was lacking. The pilot should have presented his flight plan. His immediate supervisor should have looked over it and made any suggestions or changes. And it does seem slightly lacking here, and the altitude the aircraft was given for its NAVEX wasn't necessarily safe.
The evidence all seems to point to the aircraft being hopelessly lost and flying into a mountain that they didn't expect to be there. This happen today? Can the crews of modern airliners become lost and disorientated? Ex-test pilot Chris Roberts has had an illustrious career piloting military and commercial aircraft across the world. How is modern technology supposed to prevent repeats of Sharp Top Mountain?
Largely, it's because these days the systems on the aeroplane, the instruments and the navigation facilities are much more sophisticated and far more accurate. For example, you've got the Global Positioning System, GPS. And I think we're all used to having GPS in our car, sat-nav. Now we have the computer-based systems where the entire flight deck or cockpit environment has computer backups to present highly accurate, highly reliable data to the pilots in an easy-to-read form. So the availability of facilities to the pilot is far, far above what it was 70 years ago to the B-25 crew.
But even with the very latest technology, accidents can and do happen.
It's extremely rare for a modern aeroplane to fly into terrain or a mountain, but of course it does happen. We know that happens, and it's sort of 1 in a 10 million event. And normally it's due to some kind of human failing in that a certain set of conditions not taking into account, or the crew involved or the advisors of the crew failed to give them some critical information. For example, there was the Air New Zealand aeroplane that flew into Mount Erebus over the South Atlantic area, and that was due to the computers being loaded with incorrect data, for example. So the crew, to an extent, didn't have a chance. We're all human, and when we make mistakes, if the safety systems aren't there, or you've disregarded a safety system, then catastrophe can still occur, but it's extremely rare.
Garth is now back home and weighing up Gary Wan's analysis with the evidence gathered in America. Garth concludes that the B-25's lit cockpit and low flying height provide definite proof that the aircraft was simply hopelessly lost. As the plane managed to climb high enough to hit sharp top at roughly 3,000 feet, there was nothing wrong mechanically and there were no problems with power. So where did they think they were?
The east-facing crash site location and Bobby saying that the aircraft did a C-turn over Suck Mountain is key to the investigation.
Suck Mountain is 8 miles north of Bedford and is 2,178 feet in height. Perhaps Blackwell became confused.
If we suppose that Blackwell mistook Bedford for Lynchburg that night, then the height distance of Suck from Bedford is very similar to the mountain north of Lynchburg called High Peak.
At nearly 3,000 feet in height, High Peak Mountain sits 11 miles north of their intended turning point of Lynchburg. The change in the landscape might have been enough to convince Blackwell that they were over their intended target and that they needed to turn round and head home. This is where Garth believes the report is wrong.
According to the report, the plane flew straight over Bedford and into Sharp Top, but it hit the mountain from the east. This would mean that it's way, way off course and coming from a completely strange direction to agree with the report. It must have made a turn.
If the crew made a turn to the west between Lynchburg and High Peak, then they would have cleared easily any of the high ground to the northwest of Lynchburg. If they had tried to do that near Suck, then they would have flown straight into Sharp Top.
I believe the crew thought they knew where they were. They thought they were heading home. But because of their actual position, they didn't make it.
Garth cannot be 100% sure of his theory, but he's more certain about where the blame for the crash lies. With a recommendation in the report that in future, all crews should fly at least 2,000 feet higher than any obstacles between their beginning and end locations and 100 miles beyond, Garth believes the Air Force gave a tacit acknowledgement that they had got it wrong.
The altitude that they were briefed to fly at was obviously way too low for that route. Why else would they have mentioned it? But this was wartime, and the US Air Force was relatively young, and still feeling their way around in training such a large amount of men in such a short space of time.
The war was raging, and men and machines were needed for the Air Force. This rush to maintain their war effort was bound to result in mistakes. But the figures bear repeating. During the Second World War, more than 15,000 men lost their lives on training flights in the United States. On a lonely mountain in West Virginia, those 5 young men in their B-25 became just another part of that extraordinary number.